The wind was crying that day. Not howling, not shrieking, crying. Low and mournful, like a mother who'd long since run out of tears but kept weeping just the same. It dragged its fingers across the plains, sweeping dust into old fence posts, peeling splinters from weather-worn rails, and moaning through the dry grass like it knew what had been done here. A crow landed on the cracked fence rail, tilted its head, and hopped backward when it saw her. The woman. She was tied to the fence with rusted wire that bit deep into her wrists. Her back hunched, not in defeat but exhaustion, as if her bones remembered what strength once felt like and were grieving its absence. Her long skirt was torn at the hem and dark with dried blood. Her boots had no soles. Her hair hung in clumped strands across her face, sun-scorched, wind-whipped, and knotted like seaweed. But her eyes, if you looked closely, had not dimmed. Beside her, 2 little girls lay slumped in the dirt, tied as well. One was barely old enough to walk, the other just past the age of knowing what cruelty meant. Their cheeks were cracked with thirst. Their lips moved without sound. They had been left like trash beside the road. For how long, none could say. But the wind knew. In the distance, a lone rider approached, framed against the shimmer of heat and dust. His horse was lean, ribs faintly visible beneath its chestnut coat. The man atop it was broader than most, slumped with the burden of days that had never quite been his. A broad-brimmed hat shadowed his face, and his coat was worn at the cuffs. He looked like he belonged to the land, silent, scorched, and stitched together with stubbornness. When he saw them, he said nothing. The horse came to a slow stop, hooves crunching dry earth. The man dismounted without hurry, his boots hitting the ground with the sound of finality. He stood a moment, studying the scene, as if trying to understand what part of the world would unravel a mother like this. Then he moved forward. Not a word left his mouth. He didn't ask who they were. He didn't demand to know what had happened. He only crouched beside the smallest girl and gently slid his knife through the wire around her tiny wrists. She whimpered but didn't cry. Her head rolled toward her mother, who gave a shallow nod. The older girl next. Then the mother. When he tried to cut her bonds, her arms flinched. Her eyes met his, burning with something between shame and suspicion. But she didn't speak either. She just watched him. Waited. He cut the wire slowly, as if afraid that hurrying might hurt her more. When she finally fell free, she didn't collapse. She straightened. Her spine, though raw with pain, refused to bend further. She reached for her girls. But the man lifted them first. He carried the youngest in one arm, the elder in the other, their small faces pressed into his chest as if the warmth there could erase the cold they'd swallowed. The woman followed, stumbling once, catching herself. She walked with a limp that told stories her lips wouldn't. His horse snorted when they neared, unsure. But the man whispered something only the wind caught, and the horse calmed. He placed the girls gently across the saddle and gestured for the woman to mount behind them. She looked at him again. Still no words. Her eyes flicked toward the horizon. Run or trust. Stay or die. She chose to trust. He helped her up with the caution of a man who'd been taught never to touch what wasn't freely given. She gathered her girls against her chest. The man walked. Let the horse bear their weight. Took the road ahead in silence, dust trailing behind his boots like a history he no longer claimed. The cabin came into view just before dusk. It was small, bare bones and half a chimney, set into a hollow that the wind rarely reached. The fence was mended with rope. The windows shuttered. But it stood like something that had fought for its right to remain. The dog came out first. Gray-muzzled and blind in one eye. It barked once, a hoarse sound, then wagged its tail and trotted forward. The girls stirred. The older one reached down with a weak, trembling hand. The dog licked her fingers. He helped them down, one by one. Opened the door. Gestured them inside. Inside, it smelled of leather, tobacco, and the faint sweetness of dried sage. A kettle sat cold on the hearth. A rifle hung on the wall, polished but untouched. He stoked the fire, lit the lantern. She stood frozen in the doorway, unsure if she'd been brought to shelter or another kind of cage. But he didn't press her. Instead, he knelt and gently took the girls' shoes off, placing their feet near the fire. Then he walked back outside, returning minutes later with a pail of water. He placed it beside her. A bar of soap. A cloth. Still, he said nothing. She blinked once. Twice. Then lowered herself slowly to the floor near her daughters. Her body ached in places long since numbed, but she didn't cry. She dipped the cloth in water and began cleaning their faces. Each gentle stroke broke something loose inside her. They had survived. That night, the girls slept in the rancher's bed. He slept by the fire with the dog curled beside him. The woman sat awake in a rocking chair by the window, staring out into the dark. She didn't know his name. He hadn't asked for hers. But the silence wasn't empty. It held space. Space to breathe. To begin again. As dawn crept into the sky, she finally allowed herself to close her eyes. Not to dream. That would come later. But to rest. Just for a while. And far off in the distance, the wind sighed, not from grief this time, but from relief. The cabin held its breath the first few days. Like it wasn't used to hearts beating inside it again. Like it had grown old learning to forget the laughter of a family, the clink of spoons in tin bowls, the hush of children settling into quilts. The walls had long since stopped echoing. But now there were footsteps, tiny ones, soft and unsure, and the creak of floorboards that no longer sounded lonely. The woman moved through the space slowly, like someone stepping into her own skin after years of being locked out of it. Her name remained unspoken. Not because it was forgotten, but because saying it might summon back the ghosts that once shouted it in anger. She carried herself with a stillness born not of fear, but of restraint, a life lived ducking from shadows. But now the wind outside no longer howled in hunger. It seemed to rest against the cabin instead, as though watching over them. The two girls, still weak from days of thirst, began to brighten by degrees. The older one, rail-thin and watchful, took to brushing the old sheepdog with a broken comb she found under the hearth. She never spoke, not yet, but she hummed sometimes. Small tunes without words, like little prayers for nothing in particular. The younger child cried at night, soft whimpers muffled against her mother's chest, but she clung tightly when held and leaned her cheek to the warmth of the dog's side when he lay near the fire. The man, the rancher, moved about them with a gentleness that didn't draw attention to itself. He rose early, chopped wood before the sun crested the ridge, and mended the east fence in the afternoons. He worked with the patience of someone who had long since learned that nothing good comes from rushing things. He never asked them to speak. Never demanded thanks. He brought them water, left food where they could find it, and kept his eyes down when he passed near the woman as she carried her daughters across the room. She watched him more than he knew. Watched how he ran his fingers along the grain of wood before cutting. How he removed his hat when stepping inside, even if just to set down kindling. How he always left his boots outside the door, even on cold nights. There was no ring on his finger, no photograph on the shelf. No woman's shawl folded in a corner. Just him. Alone, like the hills. But solid. Like they'd always been there. The cabin began to change in tiny ways. She swept the floor one morning, he noticed, though he said nothing. The next day, he left a small bundle of wildflowers on the table without a word. They weren't arranged, not tied. Just gathered. She stared at them for a long time before placing them in a tin cup near the window. And when the girls saw them, they smiled, wide and wordless, and that smile seemed to draw something open in the walls themselves. She repaired the hem of her dress with a patch from an old pillowcase. Later, she found a folded shawl, old but warm, left neatly on her bed. He came in one evening with a fresh splinter deep in his palm. Without speaking, he sat at the edge of the hearth, hand held out. She took it gently, her fingers trembling slightly at the contact. She worked it out with a needle, slow and careful. He winced once but didn't pull away. "Thank you," he said quietly. It was the first time she'd heard his voice up close. Low, like a cello string touched softly. She gave a faint nod, not yet ready for her own words. But something in her posture said she'd heard him. Heard more than just the word. The girls began to explore the space beyond the cabin. The older one traced the edge of the fence with a stick, walking it like a tightrope. The younger chased a butterfly and fell laughing into a patch of clover. Their mother watched from the porch, a small sewing basket in her lap, eyes narrowed not in suspicion now, but in wonder. How quickly children remember joy when no one is frightening them. Later, inside, the girls fell asleep wrapped in quilts that still smelled faintly of cedar. The woman sat at the table, mending a shirt with a fraying collar, his shirt. He had left it there deliberately. A quiet offering. She worked at it slowly, threading the needle like she was threading a memory through her own skin. He entered only after she'd finished. Picked it up, held her gaze for a moment. Then nodded. That was all. They didn't need more. That night, the fire crackled low. The wind passed by without peering in. And for the first time since she'd stepped across the cabin's threshold, the woman slept without waking in panic. The next morning, she rose early. The girls were still asleep. The rancher had already gone out. She found a loaf of bread on the table, wrapped in a towel, still warm. And beside it, a small tin of honey. She hadn't tasted sweetness in years. She spread it across a slice, tore it into pieces, and gently woke her daughters. The younger one smiled, sticky-fingered. The older leaned her head against her mother's side. No one spoke. Later that day, the woman stepped outside without her shawl. The sun touched her face, and for a moment she closed her eyes and tilted her chin upward. A gesture so small, but it was the first time she had invited the light to see her. He watched from the pasture, leaning on the fence, wiping sweat from his brow. He didn't wave. Didn't call out. Just watched, still and steady, like the earth itself taking note of something fragile beginning to bloom. The girls drew shapes in the dirt with pebbles. A crooked heart. A house with a chimney. A stick figure between two smaller ones. She saw it. Didn't erase it. Just let it stay. That evening, the woman brought out a tin bowl filled with water, soap crumbled into it, and washed the girls' hair outside in the sunlight. They giggled, shivering under the cool splash. And then she began to sing, softly. A lullaby she thought she'd forgotten. The words spilled from her like they'd been waiting, just beneath the dust. Inside the cabin, the man sat on the floor with the dog's head in his lap. He listened. Eyes closed. As if her voice brushed the cracks in him too. No one asked where she had come from. No one told her she had to stay. But she stayed. Not because she was trapped. Because, for the first time in a long, long while, it felt like staying was her decision to make. And though no promises had passed between them, and no futures had been spoken, the silence between the woman and the man had changed shape. It no longer felt like distance. It felt like breath. And the cabin, forgotten, weathered, stubborn, began to breathe with them. The days passed like pages turning in a journal that no one dared write and yet, just lived. Quietly. Fully. As if the wind might overhear and blow it all away if they ever named what was growing. The girls found their voices first. The younger one, curious and chirping, tugged at her mother's skirts, babbling half-words that didn't need clarity to be understood. The older girl remained cautious. She measured her joy, tested it against the silence. But she no longer flinched when footsteps approached. She took to drawing horses on the porch planks with charcoal, careful, deliberate lines, as if she believed in permanence again. Their mother had begun to change too, but not in a way anyone could point to with a finger. It was in the way she stood straighter while hauling water. In how she tied her hair back before tending to the garden patch that hadn't bloomed in years. She moved through the cabin like she belonged to it now, not as a guest, not as a shadow, but as someone rebuilding the home she had been denied. And the rancher, he saw all of it. He never intruded, never asked questions he had no right to ask. He simply offered steadiness. A presence more reliable than the rising sun. And in return, she began offering small pieces of herself, not as debt, but as choice. One morning, she found the axe blade dull. Without a word, she carried it to him in the pasture where he was mending the wire fence. He took it from her hands, nodded, and said softly, "I'll have it sharp by sundown." The words weren't just about the axe. She heard it. Later that evening, when he placed the tool back by the porch, edge gleaming, he found a small linen bundle waiting there. 2 slices of cornbread still warm, wrapped in a cloth stitched with forget-me-nots. He didn't eat them right away. Just stood for a long time with the bundle in his hands, something soft passing over his face, almost reverence. That was how it worked between them. Wordless acknowledgments, tender exchanges that said more than confessions ever could. But even in still water, shadows swim. He was on his way back from town when the past found her again. A rider. Broad-shouldered. Sneering. Dust on his boots and cruelty in his grin. He didn't knock. Just pushed the gate open and leaned against the fence like he owned it. "You think changing your address changes what's owed?" he asked, eyes scanning the porch where the girl's drawings had faded in the sun. She stood in the doorway, shielding her daughters behind her. Her voice didn't shake this time. "There's nothing owed." He laughed. "That husband of yours died without paying his debts. And you're part of what he left behind. Might be some law out here, but I don't see no one enforcing it." She didn't reply. Not with words. But she picked up the axe that lay near the woodpile. Her hands were steady. She held it not as a threat, but as a warning. His smile faltered. The rancher returned just as the man turned to leave, dust trailing behind his horse like the stench of something rotting. That night she didn't sleep. He found her on the porch near midnight, sitting with her knees pulled up, arms wrapped tight around them. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't seeing the stars. He didn't ask what happened. She didn't offer it. But when he sat beside her, not too close, she leaned, just slightly, against his shoulder. And when her voice came, it was hoarse, like it had to dig its way up from some forgotten cavern inside her. "I used to believe that surviving was enough. Just getting through the day. Just not dying." His breathing remained slow. She kept going. "But it's not. Surviving isn't the same as living. And She paused, eyes closing against the breeze. "I want more than just not being hurt." A long silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Just full. He didn't speak until she turned toward him. "You're more than what was done to you," he said. Quiet. Final. Like a truth carved in stone. And that was when something inside her shifted. She rose before the sun the next day. Woke the girls, dressed them, braided their hair with wildflowers, and packed a small satchel. She waited by the porch for him to return from checking the cattle. When he did, she asked, calmly, plainly, if he'd ride with her into town. He didn't ask why. Just nodded. They rode in silence, her daughters behind them on the old mare she'd named Mercy. When they arrived, she went to the sheriff's office. The rancher waited outside. She walked in and gave her name. She told them about the men who'd hurt her, named them with a voice that didn't tremble. She signed a statement. Then walked out as though her body had just remembered how to carry dignity. Back at the cabin, she didn't speak of it. But the air around her had changed, thicker, fuller. Like her breath finally reached her lungs the way it was meant to. The girls began calling her Mama again, not in fear but in habit. Safe habit. And when the younger one scraped her knee, it was the rancher she ran to first, arms wide, tears caught in the corner of her lashes. He lifted her gently, carried her to the water basin, cleaned the wound like it mattered. She watched him. The woman. From the doorway. Watched how careful he was. How kind. Later that night, she brought out her sewing basket and sat beside him near the fire. She mended one of the girls' dresses, and when she finished, she offered him a second shirt to fix, a button gone missing. He smiled faintly. "You trust me with that?" "I trust you with more than thread," she said. Then, quiet again. Their hands worked side by side. Not touching. Just moving in rhythm. And when the wind blew that night, it didn't cry. It carried the scent of something new, something almost like peace. She knew the past wasn't finished. That man might return. Trouble might follow. But she had chosen not to live in retreat. She had remembered herself. And in that remembering, had found the first glimmers of a life that didn't just belong to her pain, but to her hope, too. She looked at the man across from her, shadows dancing across his jawline, his hands steady as always. She wondered, not for the first time, if healing could look like this. Not loud. Not sudden. But like two wounded souls learning, day by day, that love can be quiet, and still strong enough to carry them both. The evening settled slow and heavy, like smoke across the hills. The sky had been red for too long that day, and though no clouds had gathered, there was a weight in the air that made the crickets pause before their song. The kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. The rancher had spent the late afternoon hauling timber from the lower ridge. His shoulders ached, sweat gathering at the base of his neck, but he moved with the quiet rhythm of a man who had always carried more than wood. When he returned, he found the girls chasing fireflies with tin cups, their laughter flickering in and out like the lights they chased. The woman stood by the door, watching them, her arms folded, her face unreadable. He nodded to her. She gave the slightest nod back. Their peace had become a living thing now, delicate but breathing, like a deer willing to step close if you moved slow enough. And for weeks, that had been enough. But peace is not something the past lets you keep without a price. The fire started just after nightfall. Not in the hearth, not in the stove, but out in the barn. The scent of smoke reached the porch first, sharp, oily, wrong. The rancher stood fast, eyes narrowing, and then he ran. The blaze had already swallowed the lower beams. Orange licked the sky like a hungry tongue, sparks rising high into the stars. The horses kicked against their stalls. The rancher didn't hesitate. He dove into the smoke, shouting low to calm them, cutting leads with practiced hands. He led them blind through flame and ash, his shirt blackened, his breath short. The woman gathered the girls, ushered them back from the fence line. The dog barked wildly, circling, protective. Then she saw them. 3 riders at the edge of the property. One she recognized by the way he slouched in his saddle, a sneer even from this distance. Her late husband's brother. The man who'd called her property, who'd promised to return. He had. 2 more rode beside him, shadows with guns at their sides, the kind of men who only came for what didn't belong to them. Her breath caught. But she didn't scream. She turned, opened the rifle cabinet behind the door, and pulled out the Winchester. Her hands shook, but they worked. She loaded it quickly, as he'd shown her. She stepped outside. The rancher came stumbling from the barn, soot clinging to his skin like war paint. He followed her eyes. Saw them. The riders. The past. He didn't speak. Just took the rifle she handed him and checked the chamber. "I'll talk," she said, voice steady. He looked at her, brow low. But he nodded. She walked to the fence. Each step heavy, but firm. She stood with the fire behind her, casting long shadows that made her taller than she felt. "You've had your say," she called out. "Now ride on." The brother chuckled, slow and oily. "You forget who you were married to, girl? You think that piece of paper changes anything? I'm not his anymore. He's dead. And you're not hers," he said, nodding toward the cabin. "You're ours. Always were." The rancher stepped forward then. Silent still. He didn't raise the rifle. Just held it low, like a man holding the line of a fence no one dared cross. "You ride now," he said. 1 sentence. Nothing more. The wind picked up, fanning the flames. Embers spun like fireflies in reverse. One of the men reached for his revolver. A mistake. A shot rang out, not from the rancher but from her. The bullet didn't kill, but it grazed the rider's thigh, and he howled as he dropped from his saddle. The horses spooked. The others flinched. "I don't miss twice," she said. Not loud, not angry. Just certain. The sheriff's bell rang down the valley. Someone had seen the smoke, was coming. The brother cursed and wheeled his horse. "This ain't done," he spat. But they rode. Cowards, mostly. Cruel men who wore power like a borrowed coat. And she had stripped it from them with nothing but her voice and one bullet. When the dust settled and the fire faded to red coals, the barn was gone. Nothing but charred beams and a few iron nails left behind. The rancher walked through the ashes, pulling loose what little could be salvaged. The horses, unharmed, watched from the corral, skittish but alive. The girls clung to their mother's skirts, eyes wide. She bent down, held them, whispered something soft neither man nor wind could hear. Later, she found the rancher washing blood from his arm at the pump, the water dark and thin. "You didn't have to step forward," she said. He didn't look at her. "Didn't feel like a choice." "It was," she said. She stepped closer, dipped the cloth into the bucket, and began to clean the scrape on his jaw. He let her. Didn't flinch. "You've rebuilt barns before?" she asked. "A few," he said. "Well," she whispered, brushing a soot mark from his cheek, "then we'll build another." He turned to her then, finally meeting her gaze. There was no fear in her eyes now. No apology. Just steadiness. And something he never expected to see in her, not gratitude, not sorrow. But resolve. Like she'd finally remembered the strength she'd always had. They said nothing more. But that night, as they sat on the porch, him with a bandaged arm, her with the rifle still across her knees, they didn't feel like survivors anymore. They felt like people who had drawn a line in the dirt and dared the world to cross it. The fence would be rebuilt, stronger this time. The barn too. But what mattered most had already been fortified. She knew now that home wasn't a place you found. It was a place you chose to defend. And in the quiet that followed, the only fire that remained was the one between them. Slow burning. Undeniable. And unspoken still. But it would come. Like all true things. It would come. The quiet had always whispered secrets that only those who truly listened could hear. Under the vast expanse of a sky brushed in the soft blush of early dawn, the cabin and its humble surroundings murmured of promises yet unfulfilled. In the cool silence, the woman sat on the worn wooden step outside the cabin, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the first light battled the lingering night. Her hand, calloused and gentle, rested on the faded quilt draped over her lap, a quilt she had mended late into the previous night, stitch by careful stitch. In that quiet moment she recalled the years of sorrow and survival, every memory etched deep like the careful seams in her quilt. The rancher, standing a few paces away, observed her with steady calm, his gaze reflecting the hardships he too had borne. He leaned on the new fence he had built, its fresh wood resonating with the echo of his labor. In his weathered eyes lay an unspoken understanding of loss and hope, as deep and enduring as the land on which they stood. Though separate in thought, they shared a bond forged not by words but through the simple acts of living and rebuilding demanded by each new day. Inside the cabin, life stirred with modest energy. The older girl, now wiser beyond her tender years, sat by the window tracing figures in the dust with a stick. Her sketches, horses, fences, and sunlit fields, spoke of resilience and of dreams emerging from the darkness of past turmoil. The younger child, though small, carried a fierce spirit. She played quietly with her cherished doll, her soft laughter a counterpoint to the heavy quiet that filled the time-worn walls. In these small moments of innocence and rebirth, the spaces left by old wounds were slowly being filled, each smile and quiet giggle a testament to beginnings anew. That afternoon, as sunlight filtered through faded lace curtains, the woman stepped outside to tend a small garden she had planted near the cabin. With deliberate care, she knelt in the soft earth, her fingers delicately sowing seeds that promised new life. Each seed, a silent defiance against a past that had tried to claim her spirit, was a quiet assertion that she would not be defined solely by what had once hurt her. From a distance, the rancher watched her, his heart warming at the sight. He, too, had nurtured the land, and in doing so, shared in the garden's quiet transformation, believing that even the deepest scars might yield beauty. Their days fell into a measured cadence, marked by shared glances and small acts of understanding. After long hours of work, they would sometimes share tea on the porch, letting the rising steam mingle with the soft hues of evening. In those moments, the space between them filled with an unspoken language, a dialogue composed not of hurried words but of gentle looks and tender gestures. On one such evening, as the last rays of sun slipped away, the woman allowed herself to speak softly about the sorrow that had haunted her. She recounted the bitter betrayals and heartaches that had chained her spirit in the darkness. As her quiet confession faded into the ambient murmur of twilight, the rancher offered a gentle nod, a silent pledge of protection and understanding that promised a future different from the cruelty of her past. Yet the quiet was never without its reminders of battles yet unresolved. One crisp morning, as frost glistened like tiny diamonds on the edge of the freshly mended fence, a distant sound shattered the fragile calm. The urgent gallop of a horse broke through the silence, heralding the return of an old conflict that refused to be laid to rest. The woman's heart quickened at that familiar sound, the echo of threats once made by a man who had claimed her long ago. The rancher, too, recognized the cadence of those hoofs. It was the harbinger of the bitter past that had once tried to subdue her spirit, a reminder that the brother of her late husband, a remnant of a cruel and possessive world, had not yet forgotten his claim. Time seemed to slow as dust stirred in the light of the rising sun. The rancher's eyes narrowed, and his hand moved almost instinctively toward the worn rifle at his shoulder. He knew that the quiet could serve as both shield and challenge. Sometimes silence concealed the deepest reserves of strength. The woman rose from the step, the quilt slipping from her grasp as she steeled herself. With measured determination born of years of survival, she walked toward the fence, her gaze fixed on the lone rider who now stood before the broken gate. The rider halted, a dark silhouette against the pale morning sky, his face etched with malice and the remnants of old claims. His voice, grating and full of venom, broke the silence. He spat threats and demands, invoking debts unpaid and wrongs that had once dictated her fate. The woman's reply came not in a shout but as a resolute silence, her eyes clear and unyielding. As the confrontation deepened, the rancher stepped forward, his presence a quiet counterbalance to the rider's harsh words. He said nothing, yet his stance declared that he would not allow the past to reclaim what they had built together. The charged air held its breath as their silent standoff continued. The rider's threats, like bitter smoke, hung in the cold morning air, but the determined glimmer in the woman's eyes and the unwavering poise of the rancher formed an impenetrable barrier. No additional weapons were drawn. Instead, a mutual understanding passed between the two, an unspoken pact of protection forged without further bloodshed. The rider, finding no purchase in their steadfast resolve, finally spurred his horse and faded into the distance, leaving behind the lingering promise that the old world was not yet ready to relent. In the wake of that tense encounter, the quiet returned, but it was transformed. The woman, her pulse still thrumming with the adrenaline of confrontation, returned to the porch where the rancher waited with a calm that belied the moments before. Their eyes met, and in that gaze was an entire conversation of shared burdens and silent victories. The threat had receded, yet the memory of it etched a deeper understanding into the bond they shared. The quiet around them, now weighted with renewed resolve, bore the promise that together they could face both the light and the darkness ahead. Later that day, as the sun dipped and softened into gentle twilight, the woman gathered her children close. The older daughter excitedly showed her a new drawing of a strong, unbroken fence, every line drawn with the care of one who had learned to rebuild hope. The younger child, with a laugh that was as pure as the first rains of spring, played with a length of ribbon that danced in the breeze, a simple symbol of freedom. In that moment, the woman's heart swelled with a quiet pride. Though the shadows of her past lingered, they could not dim the light of what she was determined to create. As night deepened and the stars emerged one by one, the couple sat together on the porch, their hands entwined like the threads of their new tapestry. The silence that enveloped them was profound yet full, a canvas for every small act of kindness and each determined step forward. In that stillness, the woman felt the strength of a quiet resolve growing within her, a conviction that her worth was defined not by the scars she bore, but by the life she was determined to nurture. The rancher, His voice, soft as the rustle of wind through the pines, spoke of rebuilding hearts and hopes battered by life's storms. His simple words resonated deeply,